arrogant Judge Edward Chen insults John Neely Kennedy in court minutes later. He is handcuffed and dragged out in Courtroom 4B of the federal courthouse in Miami. The air was heavy, as if the very space itself held its breath, awaiting an inevitable eruption. Light streamed through the high windows, casting sharp cold streaks across the marble floor, mirroring the room's austere gravity. Hundreds of spectators, from ordinary citizens to reporters clutching cameras and notepads, crowded the wooden benches, whispering in hushed tones as though afraid to shatter the palpable tension enveloping the room. Outside the courthouse, news vans lined the curb, flashbulbs popped relentlessly, and reporters with microphones in hand paced back and forth, checking phones, adjusting earpieces, exchanging rumors that sounded more like warnings. No one spoke loudly, but everyone sensed it. Today was not just another trial, this was a battle, a confrontation whose outcome could not only affect those in the courtroom but also shake the foundations of the judicial system. At the center of attention, Judge Edward Chen sat on the bench, his presence commanding yet laced with an unmistakable arrogance. His black robe billowed with every movement, as if it too asserted his absolute authority over this room. His eyes swept across the spectators, the attorneys, the court staff, with a cold detachment, as though all were beneath his control. Chen was renowned not only for his harsh rulings but also for how he ran his courtroom like a stage where he was director, lead actor, and the audience was permitted only to watch in silence. Today, he seemed determined to turn this trial into a new performance, and his target was John Neely Kennedy, the attorney representing the defendant in a high-stakes contract dispute case. Kennedy entered the courtroom with a steady gait, his navy blue suit tailored impeccably, not a wrinkle in sight. His face betrayed no emotion, but those close to him might have noticed a slight tension in his jawline, the only sign he was bracing for an unrelenting fight. Reporters' cameras tracked his every step, seeking a moment of faltering, a hint of anxiety, but there was none. Kennedy didn't blink as a flashbulb exploded inches from his face. He paused for a second, pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and dialed. "Sarah," he said, his voice low-clipped but resolute. "Whatever happens today, I won't let myself be humiliated again." He did it once, there won't be a second time. On the other end, Sarah Mitchell, his longtime associate, paused briefly before responding in a warm yet firm tone. "Don't fight him, John. Outmaneuver him like you always do." Kennedy nodded, as if affirming something to himself, then hung up and strode directly into the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere resembled the moments before a heavyweight boxing match more than a legal proceeding. Court staff, reporters, and spectators murmured his name. Kennedy, a man who had faced major cases before, now returning to this courtroom not just to defend his client, but to prove he still belonged at the security checkpoint. The buzz grew louder. A young reporter, Emily Harper from the Miami Chronicle, waved her hand. "Mr. Kennedy, over here." He glanced at her, nodding politely, recognizing the fervor in her eyes, a spark that reminded him of himself early in his career before headlines and pressure shaped him. He passed without stopping, his gaze focused each step, event declaration of readiness. As Kennedy entered the courtroom, he immediately noticed how packed it was. There were no empty seats, even folding chairs had been brought in. Reporters perched awkwardly on benches, laptops balanced on their knees, fingers hovering over keyboards poised to capture every detail. Court clerk Karen Mitchell, stationed at her desk, looked up at him. There was no warmth, no customary professionalism, just a cold, appraising glance, as if Kennedy were a defendant rather than counsel. She leaned toward a colleague, whispering something, her lips curling into a mocking smile. Kennedy saw it, so did a few reporters, who typed it immediately. Court clerk exchanges glances, tension palpable. Every eye in the room was assessing not just the case, but Kennedy himself. Could he hold his own against Chen, the man who had once forced him to leave this courtroom in disgrace not long ago? Kennedy didn't flinch. He approached the defense table with unshakable composure, set down his briefcase, and began arranging his documents with meticulous care. For him, this wasn't a performance but a battle for truth, and he understood that when the system stopped listening to reason, sometimes it had to heed presence. He scanned the room once, no sign of Chen yet. At the prosecution table, lead prosecutor Benjamin Hayes sat comfortably, hands clasped behind his head, chair tilted back as if victory were already assured. One of Hayes's assistants whispered something, and both chuckled. Kennedy sat still, letting his silence exert pressure. The more they underestimated him, the better. Then, without warning, the side door to the courtroom creaked open. A ripple of murmurs spread through the spectators. Reporters adjusted their cameras, phones were raised. Kennedy didn't turn, but he felt the room's temperature drop cold as a glacial wind behind him. Someone whispered, "He's here." In that moment, memory flooded back like a switch flipped. On the last time he stood in this courtroom, Chen had made a mockery of him, interrupting his arguments, rolling his eyes, even accusing him on the record of playing politics instead of practicing law. Kennedy had left feeling his reputation burned to ash, but not today. He wasn't here seeking fairness, he wasn't here to salvage his image, he was here to restore something deeper. Something those like Chen had twisted justice. The courtroom Doors opened wider. Edward Chen stepped in his black robe, flowing like a storm cloud, chin held high, his expression unreadable. Yet radiating arrogant power. The room fell silent, even the sound of typing ceased. In that stillness Kennedy didn't blink. He stared straight ahead, calm, grounded, prepared, because he knew this time the rules of the game were about to change. As the doors closed behind Chen, a sharp, controlled, merciless current swept through the air. Edward Chen had entered, and the real confrontation began. The gavel struck, its sound slicing through the tension like a blade. "This court is now in session," Chen declared, his voice cold, his eyes sweeping the room as if daring anyone to challenge his authority. Without waiting for introductions, he fixed a razor-sharp gaze on the defense table. "Mr. Kennedy," he said, drawing out each syllable like a veiled reprimand, "I see you've returned to my courtroom." Surprising, the words hung in the air, laced with condescension. Kennedy met his stare with absolute steadiness. "Good morning, Your Honor," he replied, his voice clear, unwavering. Chen leaned forward, fingers steepled. "I must admit, I'm intrigued taking on a case of this complexity, given your last appearance here." He trailed off, letting the implication linger long enough for the gallery to absorb it. At the prosecution table, Benjamin Hayes smirked, exchanging a knowing glance with his assistant Karen Mitchell. The court clerk pretended to shuffle papers, but her sly grin betrayed her act. Chen turned back to his docket, as if already bored. "Let's hope you're better prepared this time, Mr. Kennedy. We wouldn't want another performance better suited for a press conference than a courtroom." Murmurs fluttered through the room. One reporter paused mid-keystroke, looking up from his laptop. Emily Harper scribbled furiously, her pen racing across the page. The tension didn't rise, it pressed. Kennedy inhaled quietly, then responded, "I assure the court, Your Honor, that I am fully prepared." His voice was even, but those who knew him might detect a faint southern cadence creeping in, a subtle sign. He was tempering emotion. Chen raised an eyebrow as if amused. "We'll see," he muttered, then motioned for the clerk to proceed with reading the case summary. But he didn't move on. He lingered, turning a page in front of him with deliberate slowness. Then he looked up again. "Your reputation precedes you, Kennedy, but in my courtroom we require more than headlines and charm." The insult was now overt, no longer cloaked in judicial decorum. Kennedy didn't react, he didn't blink. He simply rearranged a few sheets of paper before him, and nodded slightly, as if noting that the first expected blow had landed. Chen turned to the prosecution. Mr. Hayes, are you ready to proceed?" Hayes stood, his voice brimming with confidence. "Yes, Your Honor." The disparity in treatment between the two counsels was unmistakable. If it bothered anyone else in the room, they didn't show it, but Kennedy noticed, and he wasn't the only one. Emily Harper, seated in the press gallery, jotted down Judge's tone toward Kennedy, openly hostile. She circled it twice. Chen continued, "I trust we'll proceed without theatrics today. I expect counsel to conduct themselves with the professionalism befitting this court's standards." Kennedy responded with a single nod, enough to acknowledge protocol, but no more. He didn't need to argue tone. "Not now, not yet." Karen Mitchell stepped forward to hand Judge Chen a fresh set of motions. He didn't thank her. Instead, he leafed through the pages, occasionally sighing as if reviewing defense filings was beneath him. "Redundant," he muttered about one document. "Irrelevant," he declared about another. Then, peering over his glasses, he added, "I would advise you, Kennedy, to limit your submissions to matters of legal merit. This court is not interested in political rhetoric disguised as argument." Kennedy said nothing, his hands folded neatly on the table, his back straight. Chen snapped the folder shut with a sharp sound. "I will allow opening statements to begin shortly, but let it be known that this court has no tolerance for distraction or delay." He leaned back, letting silence reclaim the chamber. The message was clear. He was in control. He always was. But across from him, John Neely Kennedy merely tilted his head and offered the faintest smile, not of concession but of recognition, as if this entire sequence had been anticipated, documented, and neatly folded into a larger plan. To anyone else, it was just a moment, a pause in the procedural rhythm of the courtroom, but to Chen, had he paid closer attention, it was something else, a signal, because Kennedy hadn't come here hoping for fairness. He came knowing he'd never get it, and still he came. His moment was approaching, and when he rose to speak, Edward Chen had no intention of letting him speak freely. But Kennedy, with the patience of a seasoned chess player, was ready for the next move, and the entire room, though unaware, was waiting for that moment. The mid-morning sun filtered weakly through the narrow windows of Courtroom 4B, casting long slats of light across the polished floor, but the atmosphere inside felt colder, sharper edged, with a tension that had only intensified since the trial began. John Neely Kennedy stood at the defense table, his posture measured, his hands resting lightly on a stack of documents as he began presenting a foundational argument for his client. His tone was deliberate, each point grounded in precedent, every citation backed by case law. He had barely completed his second sentence when Judge Edward Chen interrupted, waving a hand with exaggerated weariness. "Mr. Kennedy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let's not waste the court's time with broad overviews. We need substance, not summaries." Kennedy nodded, calmly pivoting without hesitation. "Your Honor, to clarify, I'm referencing the ruling in State v. Hawthorne, which was reaffirmed under modified grounds." Chen cut in again, tapping his pen against the bench. "Are you truly unaware that ruling was superseded 2 years ago, or are we indulging in nostalgia for outdated jurisprudence?" A low chuckle rippled from the prosecution table where Benjamin Hayes leaned back, not bothering to hide his grin. His assistant whispered something, drawing another short laugh from her seat near the clerk's desk. Karen Mitchell crossed her legs, raising an eyebrow in barely concealed amusement, her pen hovering over her notepad in a show of disdain rather than diligence. Kennedy kept his voice steady. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the citation I referenced was upheld in part as recently as last term." Chen interrupted once more, his tone now openly mocking. "You're free to continue, Mr. Kennedy, but this court would appreciate it if you spared us the revisionist history of appellate law. You're not here to teach a seminar." A rustle of unease stirred through the gallery. Not everyone was buying Chen's performance anymore. Emily Harper, the young journalist from the Miami Chronicle, stiffened in her seat, her notepad already filled with shorter than documenting every interruption. Kennedy returned to his table, retrieved a document, and tried again. "If I may direct the court's attention to Exhibit B." "We'll get to exhibits in due course," Chen snapped, not glancing at the folder. "You seem quite eager to lead us somewhere, Mr. Kennedy." "One wonders why." Emily blinked. "That was no ruling, it was an insinuation." She glanced around. Some reporters typed on, desensitized to courtroom antics, but others exchanged silent looks, acknowledging that something felt off. Kennedy said nothing in response. He returned to his place, adjusted his papers with meticulous calm, and sat down. He didn't challenge. The tone didn't mirror the sarcasm. Instead, he opened a legal pad and jotted down a few words in clear, measured strokes, not frantic, not distracted, but precise, methodical. He wasn't documenting arguments, he was recording behavior across the aisle. "Benjamin Hayes rose. Your Honor, given the ambiguity of the defense's current position, may we request the court allow the prosecution to clarify the timeline on the record?" Chen nodded. Before Kennedy could respond, "Granted, proceed." Kennedy didn't protest. He made another note, a quiet flick of his pen across the page. The air in the room shifted subtly, not louder, but heavier, the kind of weight that settles when something beneath the surface begins to fracture. Hayes approached the bench, flipping through a pre-prepared timeline with the ease of someone who'd already had it blessed by the court. Kennedy watched, his posture neutral. He didn't look defeated, he looked aware. In the gallery, Emily Harper's notes slowed, her attention drifting between Chen, Kennedy, and back again. She sensed it. The line between judicial command and outright bias was blurring. "Mr. Kennedy," Chen said abruptly, "before we move forward, do you wish to challenge any part of the prosecution's timeline?" Kennedy looked up, his response succinct. "I'll reserve formal objections until the presentation of evidence, Your Honor." Chen tilted his head. "Interesting choice, very diplomatic." Another smirk from Hayes, another whisper from Karen Mitchell. Kennedy wrote something else, then closed his pad. From the back, an older man in a tan blazer whispered to his seatmate, "He's getting roasted." His tone wasn't cruel, more fascinated, like watching a predictable wreck. But Emily was no longer fascinated, she was focused, because while others watched the words, she saw the silences. Kennedy's restraint, his stillness, the way he absorbed each jab without rising to meet it. This wasn't just control, it was strategy. Chen leaned back. "Very well, let's proceed." As the next witness was called, the courtroom doors opened quietly, unnoticed by most. A woman in a tailored gray suit slipped into the back row. Moving with the confidence of someone claiming a seat rather than seeking one, from her blazer hung a small laminated badge. DOJ. She sat, hands folded, eyes locked, not on the prosecution or gallery, but on the bench. Kennedy didn't turn. He didn't need to, because while Chen believed he was still cutting with precision, Kennedy had already begun exposing every hidden blade. The woman's special agent, Linda Vasquez, had arrived at the perfect moment. The clock above the bench ticked forward, but time felt slower, stretched thin by the weight of humiliation and power plays. Chen's gaze sharpened with contempt as he addressed Kennedy again. "You may want to advise your client to consider a plea," he said casually, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "At this rate, it might be the most dignified option left." Heads turned, startled by the brazenness. Hayes leaned back, arms crossed, savoring the show. Kennedy made no effort to respond. He closed the folder before him with a deliberate motion, as if finishing a chapter. He gathered his documents, aligning them perfectly, then reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thicker than the others, its label bearing the deep blue seal of the Department of Justice. It hadn't been on the table earlier. He placed it quietly before him, parallel to his legal pad. Unopened, unexplained, a silent artifact in plain view. Chen didn't notice it. Or if he did, he ignored it. This court is now in recess, he announced, standing and straightening his robe. We'll resume after lunch. I suggest counsel use the time wisely. His eyes lingered on Kennedy, waiting for a reaction. There was none. Hayes rose with a grin, collecting his materials with the air of a man certain of victory. Karen Mitchell tapped her pen, logging the session's end. Reporters stretched, whispering into phones or rushing to update headlines. Judge pushes defense toward plea. Kennedy remained seated, his fingers resting lightly atop the DOI folder, his expression unreadable, not angry, not defeated, but still he understood something the room didn't. Silence wasn't weakness, silence was strategic, giving arrogance room to perform. And the longer Chen performed, the more he exposed. From the back, Agent Vasquez watched Kennedy with renewed focus. The folder's appearance was no accident, it was timed perfectly. Chen exited with the same swagger he'd entered, sweeping past the clerk without acknowledgement. As the gavel fell and noise swelled, Kennedy stood slowly, locked his briefcase and slung it over his shoulder. He didn't rush. Each step was a refusal to carry the weight of insult. Passing the reporters, he ignored their attempts to catch his eye. Emily Harper stood near the corridor watching. She'd noted every dig, every imbalance, but what held her now was Kennedy's restraint, the steadiness of a man not fighting to survive, but waiting to strike. Kennedy paused in the hallway, dialed his phone. Sarah answered on the second ring. I saw the updates, she said. You okay? I'm fine, he replied. It's almost over. She hesitated. The hearing? No, he said, calm and steady, his hold on this courtroom. He ended the call and slipped the phone back. The double doors of Courtroom 4B creaked open once more, but the sound carried a different weight now, not the anticipation of a trial's resumption, but the finality of a reckoning. The crowd filtered back in, some with hurried footsteps, others with deliberate calm, as if aware they were stepping into a space forever altered. The air had cooled during the recess, but beneath the polished silence hung an electric undercurrent, a sense that the room was no longer just a courtroom but a stage where justice had spoken and would not be silenced. John Neely Kennedy was already seated at the defense table, his briefcase open but untouched, his fingers resting lightly on a closed folder marked with the seal of the United States Department of Justice. His eyes were fixed forward, steady, composed, waiting not for applause or vindication but for the next step in a process he had set in motion. From the rear of the room, reporters slid into place, laptops glowing with half-written stories. Emily Harper, the young journalist from the Miami Chronicle, sat 3 rows back, her notepad filled with circled phrases. Judicial bias, DOJ intervention. Chen unraveling across the courtroom. The prosecution table was eerily quiet. Benjamin Hayes, the once confident lead prosecutor, sat with his hands clasped, his legal pad blank, his earlier smirk replaced by a tight-lipped expression of unease. The empty bench loomed above them, all its vacant chair a silent testament to the morning's upheaval. The gavel lay untouched, its absence louder than any verdict. Then, without warning, the side doors opened, and a hush fell like a curtain. Edward Chen did not appear. Instead, Deputy Director Lauren Vasquez of the Department of Justice stepped into the room, her navy blazer crisp, her gold badge catching the light. She didn't pause for the room to settle, her presence commanded it. Walking down the center aisle, she stopped at the heart of the courtroom and turned to face the gallery. Kennedy stood the moment he saw her, not out of deference but readiness, as if he knew this moment marked the end of one battle and the beginning of another. Ladies and gentlemen, Vasquez began, her voice firm yet unhurried, carrying over the room without a microphone. I am here on behalf of the United States Department of Justice to confirm the following. Judge Edward Chen is now under federal investigation and subject to a sealed indictment for obstruction of justice, accepting bribes from private corporations, abuse of judicial authority, and willful violations of the Judicial Conduct and Disability Act. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a lightning strike across a quiet sky. A man in the gallery dropped his phone, the clatter echoing briefly. The stenographer froze mid-keystroke. A reporter in the third row stood instinctively, mouth agape, camera raised. Another shouted, "Can you confirm the offshore accounts?" Vasquez ignored the question, continuing without blinking. By federal code, all open proceedings presided over by Judge Chen in the past 12 months will be subject to internal DOJ review, including reassignment and audit effective immediately. This courtroom is no longer under his jurisdiction. Hayes leaned forward, his brow furrowed, struggling to process the implosion unfolding before him. This was no longer a scandal, it was a dismantling of an institution. A woman in the gallery called out, "What about today's case?" Vasquez nodded toward Kennedy. Today's proceedings have been logged for evidence. Counsel Kennedy's motion to suspend proceedings was not only valid but necessary to preserve the integrity of this courtroom. A beat passed, then murmurs erupted. Emily Harper rose, speaking into her recorder. "We are witnessing an extraordinary moment in American judicial history. A sitting federal judge, once hailed for efficiency, now stands accused of betraying the institution he swore to uphold. This is a national crisis of Legal confidence. Vasquez handed a printed statement to the court clerk, who stared at it as if it might burn through the paper. The document was brief, 5 lines on DOJ letterhead, but it confirmed what everyone now understood: the rule of law had been tested and restored through fire. Kennedy stood still as the room swirled into chaos, reporters shouting, cameras clicking, a security officer speaking urgently into his walkie-talkie. He had fought for this moment, not for himself, but for every client, every citizen who believed the system would protect them, only to see it buckle under pressure today. That system had cracked open, letting light pour in, but a darker question lingered. Kennedy met Vasquez's eyes, and she softened her voice, speaking quietly enough that only those nearby heard. "We'll need a team to review every decision he touched," she said. "You were right to question it all, Kennedy. We should have seen it sooner." He nodded. "Once how many people were sentenced under his gavel?" he asked, not rhetorically, but because the answer would shape his next steps. "How many lives were torn apart because a corporation paid to till justice?" Vasquez didn't reply. She didn't need to. From the gallery, a middle-aged woman stood, her face pale but resolute. "My brother got 10 years under Chen," she said, her voice trembling. "He swore something wasn't right." A man across the aisle turned. "My son too." Chen dismissed. "Our only evidence." Kennedy looked around. The floodgates had opened. What began as a defense against one corrupt ruling had become a mirror held up to the entire system. The crowd buzzed with disbelief, anger, and realization. The truth hadn't just entered the courtroom, it had been waiting silent until someone dared to listen. Now it was roaring. Kennedy stepped forward, holding a simple manila folder. He approached the clerk's desk and laid it down with purpose. "I'm submitting this to the Department of Justice for immediate review," he said, his voice even but resonant inside. "Our 17 case files, each tried under Judge Chen over the last 8 years, each potentially influenced by the pattern of corruption exposed today." Gasps fluttered again, a second wave of shock. He continued. 17 families who reached out in recent months, 17 cases where verdicts came too fast, too clean, too skewed, 17 reasons we cannot let today be the end. Vasquez received the folder, her grip tight, her nod one of solemn understanding. This was no longer about one courtroom or one judge, it was about the architecture of justice. A juror, an older woman with silver hair tied in a tight bun, sat still, her eyes fixed on the folder, beginning to water. Her lips trembled slightly. Emily Harper's lens caught at first. "I served on one of those cases," the woman whispered, not for drama, but because the truth stole her breath. 4 years ago, drug possession and robbery." He said he was innocent. He cried. Her voice broke as she looked at Kennedy. "We deliberated for less than 2 hours." Chen seemed so certain, so impatient. "I thought we were right." Hayes turned to her, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something like shame. Kennedy stepped closer, not offering comfort, but acknowledgement. "Justice isn't just about being right," he said gently. "It's about having the space to question if you were wrong." The woman nodded, silent, tears tracing her cheeks. Another juror placed a hand on her arm, a futile gesture against the weight of the moment. In the press gallery, a reporter typed, 17 cases under review. How many lives shaped or shattered by false integrity? This was no longer a courtroom, it was a chamber of reckoning. Vasquez opened the folder carefully, her assistant scanning the first pages: names, docket numbers, trial summaries, attached letters. Each case hinted at a pattern. Evidence dismissed without explanation, witnesses barred, sentences harsh for first offenses. Threads of something sinister. Chen's power wielded as a weapon, not a scale. Hayes rose slowly, his movement heavy. "I led 3 of those cases," he admitted aloud. "I thought he was tough, not tainted. I didn't question it. That's on me." Kennedy didn't interrupt. Hayes turned to Vasquez. "I want to assist the review, testify if needed. We need to clear the rot from within, starting with my own." A ripple of stunned murmurs followed. A young assistant on Kennedy's team looked up, surprised, perhaps seeing that even prosecutors could shed armor in the light of truth. Vasquez nodded tightly. "Noted, Mr. Hayes. Your cooperation will be logged and welcomed." Then, to everyone's surprise, she turned to Kennedy. "Counsel, any objections to Mr. Hayes's participation moving forward?" Kennedy studied him, not just his words, but his posture, his eyes, the shift. Hayes wasn't saving himself, he was seeking redemption for something larger. "No objections," Kennedy replied, "as long as he understands this isn't about reputations, it's about rebuilding trust in a system that failed too many." Hayes gave a solemn nod. "Understood." The moment felt historic. Just hours ago, these two had been adversaries, trading motions like sword strikes. Now, with the mask of procedure stripped away, they stood as allies, if not friends, united by a cause greater than either. Justice. Emily Harper's headline formed. Prosecutor and defense join forces after courtroom collapse. The courtroom, once a place of scripted roles, had become a rare space where truth bent rigid hierarchies. Kennedy returned to his seat, his fingers brushing the folder he'd submitted. He glanced at the doors outside. The nation watched, live stream, social media headlines buzzing. But here it wasn't about narratives, it was about repairing what was broken. A woman in the crowd stood holding a photo of a young man in a military uniform. He served 2 tours, got caught in a protest. Chen gave him 7 years for resisting arrest, no priors. He's still in prison. Vasquez signaled her team to note the case. Kennedy nodded. And that's why we don't stop here. The air shifted again. Faces once clouded with confusion now held purpose. Chen's reign had collapsed, but in its place stood a mountain of damage yet to be understood, let alone repaired. This wasn't the end of a trial, it was the start of a search for every life touched, every case poisoned, every sentence tainted by corruption hidden beneath robes. Kennedy walked to the center of the room, addressing the gallery, the reporters, the families clutching old court papers or photos. "You were told this case was about a contract dispute," he said, his voice low but clear. "But it was never about the contract, it was about a system that let a judge twist the law into a weapon and wield it without question." He paused, his gaze sweeping from the gallery to the empty bench. "And now we must ask not just what he did, but what we failed to see, what we excused, what we ignored." The silence that followed was honest, not complicity, but a collective facing of what had been built. Kennedy leaned forward slightly. "Justice doesn't always knock loudly, sometimes it waits silent until someone refuses to look away." He turned to Vasquez. "Has the DOJ contacted the appellate court about Chen's prior convictions? We're drafting emergency review motions," she replied. "This is just the beginning." Kennedy nodded. "Good, it should be." The gavel remained untouched, its absence speaking louder than any verdict. Chen's reign ended not with fanfare, but with the weight of laws he'd once manipulated now speaking in his place. What came next would shake federal power beyond this courtroom. Kennedy, once seen as an underdog, had become a witness who refused to be silenced. The air grew cold, not from the air conditioning but from the vacuum of authority left behind outside. Reporters broadcasted federal judge indicted suspended mid-trial. Inside power had shifted not by force but by one man's refusal to stay seated when truth demanded otherwise. In a quiet DOJ conference room, walls bare of distraction, senior review team members sat around a mahogany table, laptops glowing with case files, coffee cups untouched. Vasquez stood at the head, addressing them. "We've confirmed inconsistencies in 13 cases already, and we're not halfway through year 3. Rivera beside her added, "Some verdicts had no physical evidence, just witnesses tied to Chen's private investments." Vasquez continued, "Every conviction from the last 5 years will be reviewed. Jury instructions, sentencing patterns. If there's external influence, we reopen, investigate, exonerate if needed." An analyst raised his hand. "Ma'am, Ethan Shaw's name appears repeatedly in Chen's high-profile trials." Rivera froze. "Shaw, now senior counsel at the state attorney's office." The analyst nodded. "His communications with Chen were too frequent for protocol." Vasquez leaned forward. "Get his file, every deposition he touched. If he's compromised, we move fast." Outside, the public was digesting the news, social media ablaze with outrage. But here reform's gears ground forward. A screen lit up with a secure transmission. Kennedy's face appeared composed. "Cleared. Thank you," he said simply. "We're not just fixing one judge, we're fixing everything he touched." Vasquez nodded as the feed faded. Rivera opened another file, another case, another voice waiting to be heard. The screen faded to black, a haunting piano note echoing softly. Images emerged. Courtroom 4B's empty benches, a vacant judge's chair, Kennedy's calm eyes, Chen's diminished profile, reporters' stunned faces. A narrator's voice, low and reflective, began. This wasn't about revenge, not for John Neely Kennedy, not for the DOJ. It was about something larger, something forgotten in the noise of courtrooms and laws. Layers. Integrity isn't defined by robes or titles, but by choices, protecting what's right when no one watches or when everyone does. A violin joined the piano as Kennedy stepped from the courthouse into sunlight, not smiling, not waving, just walking. He didn't win a trial or crush a foe, he endured, held firm when others wavered, reminding a fractured system what justice looks like when it's a living act. The courtroom door closed, its placard reading "Courtroom 4B closed for review." The narrator continued, "This began with a judge who thought himself untouchable, but it ends with a question for us all: what do we protect when we fight for justice?" Kennedy's signed suspension order appeared beside an overturned gavel. Sometimes one refusal to stay silent, one person speaking when it's easier to turn away, shifts an entire institution. White text faded in. "What would you do if you stood before a system that forgot justice? Would you stay silent or rise like Kennedy did?" The story didn't end with applause, but with a truth undeniable. One person brave enough to stand can halt a machine of power. Kennedy didn't shout to be heard, he stood still, and his silence woke a nation. The lesson: justice isn't fame or power, it's action, conviction, courage. If one man could shake a system with a signature and unflinching gaze, what can't you do when you see injustice? Will you stay silent or make the world listen? Share your thoughts below and pass this story on if you believe justice begins with someone brave enough to say enough. And thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.